at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight, as the United States concluded what can only be described as the worst single day in American diplomatic and economic history, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal simultaneously published identical front-page stories. Identical. 3 separate newspapers, 3 separate editorial boards, 3 separate newsrooms, all publishing the exact same story at the exact same time. That doesn't happen by accident. The stories are based on leaked classified documents from within the Trump administration, over 200 pages, National Security Council memoranda, Pentagon assessments, State Department cables, CIA intelligence reports, Treasury analysis, Commerce Department evaluations. The largest single leak of classified national security information since the Pentagon Papers. And these documents reveal, in devastating detail, the single catastrophic error that allowed Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to systematically dismantle American power over the past 6 weeks. The error was not a policy mistake. It was not a negotiating miscalculation. It was not a communication failure. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of who Mark Carney is and what capabilities he brought to this confrontation. According to the leaked documents, and I'm going to walk you through specific memos, specific warnings, specific predictions that all came true, every U.S. intelligence agency, every military service branch, and every senior diplomatic official warned President Trump in early February that Mark Carney was not a typical political leader. Mark Carney is a former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, one of the world's foremost experts on international finance, central banking, currency markets, and economic warfare. He has spent his entire professional life studying how nations use economic tools to achieve strategic objectives, and he has direct personal relationships with finance ministers, central bank governors, and economic policymakers in every major economy on Earth. The leaked documents show that U.S. officials explicitly warned Trump that engaging in economic confrontation with Carney was fighting on terrain where the opponent has overwhelming advantage, and that Carney would weaponize every aspect of the international financial system that the United States has taken for granted. Trump ignored these warnings. He believed that American economic size and military power would force Canada to capitulate regardless of who led Canada. That belief was Trump's biggest mistake. And tonight, as the leaked documents circulate globally, the world is learning exactly how Carney exploited that mistake to execute what analysts are calling the most sophisticated economic warfare campaign in modern history. Structure preview. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through the specific warnings U.S. officials gave Trump about Carney's capabilities and why those warnings were ignored. I'm going to show you how Carney used his central banking expertise to weaponize currency markets, his international relationships to build the Democratic Trade Alliance, and his understanding of financial systems to target American vulnerabilities that most people don't even know exist. I'm going to reveal the timeline showing that Carney planned every major action weeks in advance, while Trump reacted impulsively, giving Canada permanent initiative advantage. I'm going to explain why fighting an economic war against someone who governed the Bank of England was strategic suicide, and why U.S. officials knew this from day one. I'm going to break down each of Carney's 5 major strategic moves: the currency basket peg, the Article 21 invocation, the Democratic Trade Alliance formation, the infrastructure investment plan, and the timing sequencing that kept the U.S. perpetually off balance, and show you exactly how each move exploited expertise gaps in the Trump administration. I'm going to give you the internal Pentagon assessment titled "Why We Are Losing," that describes the asymmetry of expertise between Carney and Trump. And I'm going to show you the reactions tonight from the White House, from Carney, from Congress, and from financial analysts who are all saying the same thing. Trump underestimated his opponent, ignored expert advice, and led the United States into a confrontation it was never prepared to win. Subscribe to join the community tracking this crisis, and share this video if it brings you value. Because what I'm about to show you is the most comprehensive breakdown of how expertise defeats size in modern economic warfare. Let's start with the document that predicted everything. The February 3rd NSC memo. Let me walk you through the leaked NSC memo dated February 3rd, 2026, just 2 days after Trump imposed tariffs on Canada. 2 days. The memo was written by the National Security Advisor and distributed to President Trump, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The subject line reads, Assessment, Canadian Response Capabilities under Prime Minister Carney. The memo is 14 pages long. It opens with a section labeled Subject Background that provides Carney's professional history in detail. Let me read you the exact text. Mark Joseph Carney served as governor of the Bank of Canada from February 2008 to June 2013. During his tenure, he guided Canada through the 2008 global financial crisis with 0 bank failures, making Canada the only G7 nation to avoid a banking collapse. His crisis management approach became a model studied by central banks worldwide. In July 2013, Carney became governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British citizen to hold that position in the institution's 319-year history. He served until March 2020, managing the UK economy through Brexit uncertainty, developing innovative financial stability tools, including countercyclical capital buffers and stress testing regimes, and coordinating international central bank responses to multiple global crises. Carney's areas of expertise include currency market interventions and exchange rate management, sovereign debt management and restructuring, international financial institution coordination, including G7, G20, and Bank for International Settlements frameworks, economic sanctions design and implementation, trade finance mechanisms and supply chain financial architecture, central bank cooperation frameworks and liquidity provision systems. The memo continues, Carney has direct personal relationships built over 15-plus years of professional interaction with Jerome Powell, chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank, Haruhiko Kuroda, governor of the Bank of Japan, Andrew Bailey, current governor of the Bank of England, and finance ministers, treasury officials, and central bankers in more than 60 countries. Carney is widely regarded within international financial policy circles as one of the most capable and innovative central bankers of his generation. He is known for strategic thinking, long-term planning, and willingness to use unconventional policy tools. That's the background section. Already you can see the level of expertise being described. But here's where the memo becomes prophetic. The next section is titled Risk Assessment, Probable Canadian Response Strategies. And it reads like a script for everything that has happened over the past 6 weeks. Let me read you the exact text. If the United States engages in sustained economic confrontation with Canada under Prime Minister Carney's leadership, the following risks are assessed as highly probable. Risk 1. Central bank coordination to insulate Canada. Carney will leverage his relationships with allied central banks to arrange currency swap lines, liquidity support mechanisms, and coordinated interventions that insulate Canada from U.S. economic pressure. This will allow Canada to maintain financial stability despite tariffs or other U.S. measures. Risk 2. Weaponization of currency markets. Carney will use his expertise in exchange rate management to manipulate the Canadian dollar in ways that neutralize U.S. tariff impacts, create volatility in U.S. import markets, and destabilize U.S. trade relationships with third countries. Risk 3. Coalition building against U.S. policies. Carney will leverage his international relationships to build coalitions of nations that oppose U.S. economic policies. These coalitions may include formal trade alliances, coordinated WTO challenges, or alternative economic frameworks that exclude the United States. Risk 4. Exploitation of U.S. financial system vulnerabilities. Carney will identify and exploit vulnerabilities in U.S. financial systems that most U.S. policymakers do not understand. This may include targeting dollar dominance, exploiting treasury market dependencies, or destabilizing trade finance mechanisms. Risk 5. Strategic initiative through superior planning. Carney will operate with long-term strategic planning, predetermined sequencing of actions, and contingency preparations, while the U.S. administration operates reactively. This asymmetry will give Canada permanent initiative advantage, allowing Canada to control the pace and direction of the confrontation. The memo concludes the risk assessment with this paragraph. In summary, economic confrontation with Canada under Prime Minister Carney's leadership presents significant risks that do not exist with typical political leaders. Carney possesses world-class expertise in the exact domain where confrontation would occur, has relationships that enable him to coordinate international responses, and has a demonstrated track record of outmaneuvering larger opponents through superior planning and unconventional strategies. Recommendation: avoid sustained economic confrontation with Canada unless the United States is prepared to commit significant resources to financial warfare and is willing to accept the risk of international coalition formation against U.S. interests. Every single risk predicted in that memo came true. Every single one. Trump's response: the fatal error. Now here's Trump's response to this memo, and this is where the fatal error occurs. According to multiple sources familiar with the February 4th NSC meeting where the memo was discussed, sources who spoke to the journalists who published tonight's stories, Trump was presented with the risk assessment by his national security advisor. The national security advisor walked Trump through Carney's background, walked him through the 5 risk categories, walked him through the recommendation to avoid sustained confrontation. And Trump's response, according to 3 separate sources who were in the room, was this: I don't care if he used to run some bank in England. Canada's economy is tiny compared to ours. They need us way more than we need them. They'll fold. One advisor tried to explain that Carney's expertise meant he could weaponize aspects of the international financial system that the U.S. couldn't easily defend against. Trump reportedly interrupted and said, "We have the biggest economy in the world. We have the most powerful military in the world. Size matters. Canada will back down. They always do." Another advisor tried to explain that modern economic warfare depends more on expertise and relationships than on raw economic size. Trump reportedly said, "That's academic nonsense. In the real world, the big guy wins. We're the big guy. End of story." According to the sources, the National Security Advisor made one more attempt. He said, "Mr. President, Mark Carney has spent 15 years building relationships with every major central bank in the world. If he calls them and asks for help against us, they might actually help him. That's never happened before in U.S. economic history, but with Carney, it's possible." Trump's response: "Then we sanction anyone who helps Canada. We're America. People do what we say or they suffer consequences. Carney will figure that out fast." That ended the discussion. Trump dismissed the memo. He dismissed the risk assessment. He dismissed the expertise warnings. And he proceeded with tariffs on Canada with no preparation for the kind of response Carney was capable of delivering. That response reveals Trump's fundamental error in strategic assessment. Trump assessed the U.S.-Canada confrontation based purely on size metrics: GDP, population, military power, trade volume. He looked at the fact that the U.S. economy is roughly 10 times larger than Canada's economy and concluded that size advantage guaranteed victory. What Trump failed to understand is that in modern economic warfare, expertise, relationships, and strategic planning often matter more than raw size, especially when the smaller party can avoid direct conventional conflict and instead fight asymmetrically using financial system manipulation. Canada's economy is smaller than America's economy. That's true. But Mark Carney's expertise in manipulating financial systems is vastly superior to anything the Trump administration possessed. And in economic warfare, superior expertise can defeat superior size if the expert can identify vulnerabilities the larger opponent doesn't even know exist. Let me show you exactly how Carney did that. Carney's first move: the currency basket. Peg D. March 9th, 2025. Canada announces it is pegging the Canadian dollar to a basket of currencies excluding the US dollar. The announcement comes from the Bank of Canada. It says the Canadian dollar will now be pegged to a weighted basket consisting of the euro, the British pound, the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc, and the Chinese yuan. The US dollar is explicitly excluded. This is an unprecedented move. No G7 country has ever pegged its currency to a basket that excludes the US dollar. And according to the leaked documents, US Treasury officials were completely blindsided. A leaked Treasury Department memo from March 9th, written just hours after Canada's announcement, asks, can Canada actually maintain a currency peg without massive foreign exchange reserves? What prevents speculative attacks on the peg? Do they have the financial firepower to defend this? These are basic questions. These are questions that reveal the Treasury Department didn't understand what Carney was doing or how he planned to make it work. The memo continues. We need immediate analysis of Canada's FX reserve position. We need to understand whether this peg is sustainable or whether it's a bluff that will collapse under market pressure. The memo shows that U.S. officials were operating in the dark. They didn't know if the peg was real. They didn't know if Canada could defend it. They didn't know what the strategic purpose was. Now here's what actually happened, which financial experts have since explained and which the leaked documents confirm. Before announcing the currency basket peg, Carney spent 2 weeks coordinating with the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, the Swiss National Bank, and the People's Bank of China. He used his personal relationships with the governors of those institutions. He called Christine Lagarde at the ECB. He called Haruhiko Kuroda at the Bank of Japan. He called Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England, and he said, Canada is going to peg to a basket that includes your currencies. If we face speculative attacks, will you provide swap line support? All of them said yes. By the time Canada announced the peg publicly, Carney had already secured over $500 billion in currency swap line commitments from the world's major central banks. A currency swap line is an agreement where one central bank provides its currency to another central bank in exchange for the other currency, with an agreement to reverse the swap at a future date. It's essentially a massive line of credit denominated in foreign currency. With $500 billion in swap lines, Canada could defend the peg against any speculative attack. It didn't matter that Canada's own foreign exchange reserves were only around $100 billion. Carney had access to $500 billion more from allied central banks. This made the peg essentially unbreakable. But here's the key point. U.S. Treasury officials didn't know those swap lines existed. The arrangements were made through direct central bank-to-central bank communications. No public announcements. No formal agreements filed with international institutions. Just personal phone calls between central bank governors who trusted each other. By the time the U.S. Treasury figured out what had happened, the peg was already operational and backed by the world's major central banks. The leaked documents include a Treasury memo from March 11th that says, we have confirmed through intelligence sources that Canada has secured significant currency swap arrangements with the ECB, BOJ, BOE, SNB, and PBOC. The peg is sustainable. We have no effective tools to break it. 2 days. It took U.S. officials 2 days to understand what Carney had done. And by then, it was too late to counter it. This is the first example of superior expertise defeating superior size. The U.S. has a much larger economy than Canada, but Carney had relationships with central bankers that the U.S. couldn't disrupt, and he used those relationships to build a financial defense that the U.S. couldn't break. Carney's second move, Article 21 invocation. March 11th, 2025. 2 days after the currency basket peg announcement, Canada invokes Article 21 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Article 21 is the Security Exception Clause. It allows any WTO member to suspend its WTO obligations if it determines that compliance would threaten its essential security interests. The key word is determines. Article 21 is self-judging. A country doesn't need permission from the WTO to invoke it. A country doesn't need to prove its security is threatened. A country simply declares that its security interests require suspension of obligations, and that declaration is legally unchallengeable. Canada's invocation statement says, the United States' imposition of tariffs and economic coercion against Canada threatens Canada's essential security interests, including economic security, food security, energy security, and national sovereignty. Under Article 21 of GATT, Canada is suspending its WTO obligations toward the United States effective immediately. This gives Canada legal authority under international trade law to do whatever it wants economically in response to U.S. actions. It can impose tariffs. It can ban exports. It can restrict services. It can cancel contracts, all without violating WTO rules. Now, here's what the leaked documents reveal. U.S. trade officials did not know Article 21 could be used this way. A leaked State Department cable from March 11th, sent from the U.S. Trade Representative's office to the Secretary of State, says, legal team is researching whether Article 21 security exception can be applied to economic security threats or whether it is limited to traditional military security threats. Precedents are unclear. We are consulting with outside WTO legal experts. Read that again. U.S. trade lawyers were researching basic WTO law, while Canada was already executing a strategy based on deep knowledge of trade law provisions. The cable continues. If Article 21 is self-judging and applies to economic security, Canada may have legal authority to take actions we previously assumed would violate WTO rules. We need urgent clarity on this. U.S. officials were trying to figure out if Canada's move was legal. Meanwhile, Carney already knew it was legal because he'd studied the WTO legal framework extensively during his time coordinating international economic policy at the Bank of England. He knew that Article 21 is self-judging. He knew that essential security interests has been interpreted broadly to include economic security. He knew that once invoked, Article 21 is unchallengeable because no WTO panel has authority to overrule a member's self-determination of its security interests. A leaked memo from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative dated March 13th confirms. External legal counsel confirms that Article 21 is self-judging and that Canada's invocation is legally valid under WTO rules. We have no mechanism to challenge it. Canada now has legal cover to take any economic action it deems necessary. Again, 2 days. It took U.S. officials 2 days to understand the legal implications of what Carney had done. And by then, Canada was already implementing policies under Article 21 authority. This is the second example of superior expertise defeating superior size. The United States has more trade lawyers than Canada. The United States has more WTO litigation experience than Canada. But Mark Carney understood a specific provision of trade law that U.S. officials had never seriously considered using. And he deployed it before U.S. officials even understood what he was doing. Carney's third move, the Democratic Trade Alliance. Between March 6th and March 10th, 2025, while the currency basket peg and Article 21 invocation were grabbing headlines, Mark Carney was quietly assembling the largest economic alliance formed against the United States in modern history, the Democratic Trade Alliance, 62 nations, including major economies like Brazil, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, Mexico, and Indonesia, representing over 3 billion people and more than $45 trillion in combined GDP. The alliance was announced on March 10th. And according to the leaked CIA documents, U.S. intelligence had absolutely no advance warning that this alliance was forming. A leaked CIA assessment from March 10th, written hours after the alliance announcement, says, "We are attempting to determine when discussions between Canada and potential alliance members began. Initial signals intelligence review shows no intercepts of relevant communications. Human intelligence sources in allied capitals report no awareness of alliance formation discussions. We are investigating whether communications occurred through channels we do not routinely monitor." Think about what that means. The CIA monitors communications of allied governments. The NSA intercepts diplomatic cables. The U.S. has intelligence sources inside the governments of close allies. And none of that intelligence apparatus detected that Canada was building a 62-nation alliance. How is that possible? The leaked documents reveal the answer. Carney didn't use official diplomatic channels to build the alliance. He used personal relationships with finance ministers and central bankers, relationships built over 15 years at the Bank of Canada and Bank of England. He called people he'd worked with directly, people he'd sat next to at G7 meetings, G20 meetings, Bank for International Settlements meetings. He called them on personal phones. He met with them privately during international conferences. He used trusted intermediaries who had no official government role. And he said, essentially, the United States is trying to use economic coercion to force compliance from everyone. We're building an alternative framework based on mutual respect and shared rules. Are you interested? Most of the finance ministers and central bankers he called said yes immediately because they'd worked with Carney for years. They trusted him. They respected his expertise. And many of them were already frustrated with U.S. economic unilateralism under Trump. By the time the alliance was announced publicly, membership commitments were already secured. The leaked documents include a State Department cable from March 11th that says, "We are conducting urgent outreach to DTA member countries to understand why they joined without consulting us. Initial responses suggest decisions were made at finance ministry or central bank level based on personal relationships with PM Carney, not through normal foreign ministry diplomatic channels. This explains why we had no advance warning." The cable continues. Several allies have indicated they view DTA membership as primarily economic and technical, not as a geopolitical alignment against the United States. However, the practical effect is the same, a coordinated coalition that will oppose U.S. economic policies. Here's what makes this particularly devastating. The Trump administration assumed that U.S. alliances were permanent, assumed that countries like the UK, Germany, Japan, and South Korea would never join a coalition against the United States, assumed that American military alliances guaranteed economic loyalty. Carney proved that assumption wrong. He showed that in the modern world, economic relationships can override security relationships, and he showed that personal trust between expert policymakers can be more powerful than formal diplomatic alliances. The leaked documents include a particularly striking Pentagon assessment from March 12th. The formation of the DTA represents a fundamental shift in international alignment. For the first time since World War II, major U.S. allies have joined an economic coalition explicitly designed to counter U.S. policy. This suggests that U.S. alliance structures are weaker than previously assessed, and that economic confrontation can fracture security partnerships. This is the third example of superior expertise defeating superior size. The United States has the most powerful military in the world. The United States has formal alliances with most DTA members. But Mark Carney had personal relationships that transcended those formal structures, and he used those relationships to build a coalition that the U.S. intelligence apparatus never saw coming. Carney's fourth move, the infrastructure plan. March 12, 2025. Canada announces an $85 billion infrastructure investment plan to redirect Canadian trade away from U.S. routes, new Pacific ports, expanded Atlantic ports, Arctic shipping infrastructure, rail connections to bypass U.S. territory, pipeline routes that avoid U.S. transit. The scale is unprecedented. $85 billion is roughly 3% of Canada's entire GDP. For comparison, that would be like the United States announcing a $700 billion infrastructure program. And according to the leaked Commerce Department documents, U.S. officials immediately dismissed the plan as impossible. A leaked Commerce Department memo from March 12th says,